presentation.
And Reza, maybe before you start, I'd like to remind the audience we have built in some time for a Q&A. And so as you listen to Reza present the findings, please prepare a few questions for us that we'll be happy to try to respond to at the end of the presentation.
Thank you, Philippe. Okay, so our report, which I'm going to present today, is going to be on the China Institute's website. So you can find the verbatim there. You can find the sort of charts and data that we have there. So I'm going to go through the report first and foremost, then I'll talk more about the research insights from this. When we look at how China sees the world, this is really a national portrait of how mainland Chinese citizens view 10 global powers and China's place among them. So essentially, what does the world look like from inside China? It is a nationally distributed sample, and it is something that's been quite consistent in the way we ask the questions since inception. In other words, we have a very durable architecture of opinion about how everyday Chinese citizens view outside actors. So I need to stress this again, is the idea that this is a portrait of an expressed public opinion. It's not about government policy. And what's really interesting is when those two items diverge. So when public opinion and government policy diverges, often that's where the most interesting story lies. What I can tell you the top line picture is that the survey illustrates that the Chinese public is confident, they're pragmatic, and selectively engaged when it comes to viewing outside actors. So we see that the public views China has arrived as a leading global power. It's unwilling to either cut economic ties with the West or export its model. So the public, not surprisingly, have seen a two-power world with the United States and China as the top influencers globally. There's an anchoring to Russia in many respects. Over the 4 waves of the survey, we see Russia plays a prominent role in many of the responses. And this is the same reality in 2026, but there's some caveats to that. And I'll talk a bit more about that. We see that the general public wants China to have leadership in terms of exporting its capability, but not necessarily ideology. So the public wants leadership in security and technology. They want a larger military footprint, but there's a little appetite for exporting China's governance overseas. Finally, if I was to suggest you what the top line takeaways are, is the sort of pragmatism towards the West. Half the population that we surveyed want deeper economic ties with the United States and Europe, but there's distrust. So there's distrust and engagement, and they both coexist. So let me give you some of the data that illustrates some of these top line points that I just made. So as I mentioned, China, the United States are perceived as the two most powerful nations and having the most influence globally. And this has been quite consistent across all the ways that we've looked at over the last 4 years. Thereafter, it's Russia, the European Union, and then we have a lower tier with Australia, India, and I'm sad to say Canada. The everyday Chinese do not see Canada as having much influence globally. There is a clear-eyed respect for the US and the US's capability, even though, as we're going to see, warmth towards the US is not necessarily the reality. Another thing that we look at is who does China trust and who it does not. Akin to the other iterations of the survey, Chinese citizens tend to trust Russia the most. It's seen as the most trusted partner, whereas the least trusted partner is Japan and the United States. I am going to say a few words about Japan and talk about why Japan has actually gotten worse in terms of trusting Japan, and there's a wariness towards Japan and what that actually means. I'm also going to talk about the trust with Russia a bit more as well. This is something that Philippe and I have scratched our heads about and debated over the last few years. Why is Russia so trusted? Is there a blip in the data? Is there a blip in the methodology? But after 4 years of a consistent pattern, Russia consistently is viewed as a trusted actor towards everyday Chinese. Canada sits in a moderately middle band. Trust neither high nor poison, so there's headroom for improvement. And we'll talk a bit more about that as well. in terms of importance, 77% call the Russia relationship highly important. And paired with high trust, as I just mentioned, the partnership is it's incredibly embraced. So this is an interesting sort of chart to be seen here. What the chart is looking at is we ask citizens who is the most important relationship to China, and then we ask citizens who is the most trusted actor towards China. And so ultimately, what we find here is it's only with Russia we see a strong relationship between trust and importance of relationship. Thereafter, we see this bifurcated sort of relationship between trust and importance of relationship. Look at the United States, for example. 12% are actually trusting of the United States, whereas 64% suggest it is a important relationship. So you see this wide gap between trust and the idea that you need to have a sort of an important relationship. And so that wide gap is something that is interesting analytically, and I'll say a few words about that as well. Um, but again, the top line here is the fact that generally speaking, the more trusted the actor, the more likely you are to engage with the actor. But it doesn't necessarily mean you see it as a there's a discord between the importance of that relationship and trust. And this is what this chart illustrates here. If I was to continue onwards, one of the questions we've been asking is, um, who would China potentially engage in a conflict in the next decade with? And historically, well, over the last 4 years, the United States has been the number one actor who Chinese citizens believe there's a potential for conflict within the next decade. In this iteration, Japan took the first place. This is partially, well, largely the reality of the fact that in November of last year, the Prime Minister of Japan made some statements that was not well received in China. That's putting it very lightly. What we see is that those statements really created a sort of conflictual sort of reality. And in fact, it's the basis of one of our research notes, which I'm going to talk about. Is this idea that the Chinese view towards Japan has always been antagonistic at a baseline. But even more so, it's been activated to the point in this iteration where citizens actually believe that there's a potential for conflict with Japan within the next decade. If we look at France, Germany, Canada, Australia, the UK, Russia, statistically speaking, the citizens do not see a conflict occurring anytime soon. With the United States, there is a potential, but that potential is reducing itself. There's a caveat to this. We talked about in the survey looking at how citizens view reunification with Taiwan. And when we looked at those reunification figures, what we see is that citizens are okay with the status quo. However, if they are going to engage in a sort of reunification conversation, it should be diplomatically resolved. However, if the United States is involved, then citizens really are advocating for a sort of a military solution. So there you see how complicated the United States position is insofar of the image that Chinese citizens have of the United States and its potential for the likelihood of military conflict with China. Let's continue onwards in terms of where the public wants China to lead. Uh, Again, this is something that's been quite consistent over the last 4 years. It's this idea that Chinese citizens want China to play a major role in peace and security, thereafter technology and innovation. There's minimum support for China to actually export its financial governance models, its environmental governance models globally. So peace and security is number one, technology and innovation is number two. And this has been quite consistent over the 4 years. Now, this is interesting because it actually matches up to the current 5-year plan, extending to 2030, insofar that China is increasing its military budget. It has greater emphasis on technology and innovation in terms of its spending. And so there seems to be a lockstep in terms of what citizens want and what the government is providing in terms of this 5-year plan. But even more so is this idea that China could be a force for good globally in terms of peace and security, in terms of peacekeeping. We did a battery of questions, which I don't present today, but we did a battery of questions where we ask citizens, should China have a greater role in peacekeeping? And overwhelmingly, citizens want China to play a greater role in terms of the Israel conflict, in terms of Ukraine, Russia. So in major hotspots, citizens want China to play a major role in those conflicts. Whether or not it's diplomatically or whether in terms of providing peacekeepers, citizens want China to be a force for good. So this is where the public wants China to lead. If we were to continue onwards to dig a bit deeper, what are the preferred partners for trade and technology? Here again, Russia plays this prominent role, whereby Russia leads both economic and technological cooperation. And this is followed by Germany, the EU, the UK, and France. So the Europeans and the UK are generally seen as preferred partners for trade and technology in the eyes of everyday Chinese citizens, whereas Japan is seen as the least sort of entity to cooperate both economically and technologically, followed by India, Australia, US, and Canada. Um, Japan, again, Japan might play a role. There might be some bias towards the Japanese case simply because of the sort of media as well as the government sort of rhetoric towards Japan since November of last year. So that can play a major role. India, it's just not really in the geist of the everyday citizen. It's not seen as preferred sort of tourism. It's not seen as a preferred education destination. It's not seen as a preferred place for trade and technology, even though India is a growing economy and it has a lot of opportunities for Chinese firms and Chinese consumers. It's just not seen as a place where everyday citizens see a potential for economic and technological cooperation. Um, what was really interesting from this is looking at Germany and France and the EU, whereby Germany is increasingly being seen as a preferred partner for trade and technology. And this is a pattern we've seen increasing over the last few years in terms of our survey data. The Europeans and the French as well is seen as a preferred sort of destination, whereas Canada, the United States, not as much as, say, our European counterparts. Australia, even though Australia has a good trading relationship with China, although it can be antagonistic at times, it's a bit surprising to see that economic and technological cooperation is not seen as favorably relative to other actors, i.e., Germany or the Europeans. So Australia is at the bottom in terms of trade and technology for this particular survey. Continuing onwards, one of the questions we ask is, where should Chinese citizens want to go? So essentially, it's interesting because we ask high-level questions insofar who do you trust? Who should China trade with? Who should they cooperate with? But this is an everyday question. Where do you actually want to go for tourism? Where do you want to go and study? Where do you want to go to work? Where do you want to migrate to? The migration number is really interesting. What we've seen over the last 4 years is a decrease in the reported appetite of Chinese citizens wanting to immigrate elsewhere into the Western jurisdictions. So if you would look at the earlier figures, they were in double digits for some of these countries. Now, pretty much every country it's in the low single digits. Australia is top for immigration, whereas the United States is top for work, tied with Germany. In terms of studying, if we see the sort of traditional powerhouses of the United States, the UK, Germany, and Australia are seen as destinations of choice for everyday citizens. India, not so much. Japan, not so much. Canada, we're declining, in fact, in terms of everyday citizens wanting to study here in terms of this poll. And so if you look at previous years, Canada had a much higher standing. We seem to be declining. In terms of tourism, France, Russia, UK, and Australia, and Canada is there as well in the middle bands. India is not seen as a preferred choice, and the United States is not seen as much of a preferred choice, and that's been declining over the last few years. Continuing onwards, let's given we are a Canadian institute, we did some questions that were more Canada specific. So we were asking questions about how Chinese citizens view Canada in terms of cultural exchanges, in terms of cooperation, in terms of security, in terms of governance, in terms of environmental cooperation. Now, the key bit here is this. Support for Canada-China cooperation amongst everyday citizens in China has risen across all our 5 major domains since 2023. And this is led by cultural exchanges. In other words, even though we're not seen as the actor to cooperate with in terms of economic and technology relative to other Western jurisdictions, support for corporation is still there at a micro level. Citizens in China do want to have greater cultural and economic cooperation, um, at least if you look at it year over year over the last few years. So there is a willing public, and this is important because it lowers the cost of re-engagement with China. It means that the public in China wants to engage with Canada, and to do so, it would require more people-to-people exchanges. And so one of the artifacts that might limit this sort of goodwill is that the general public in China cannot divorce the United States from Canada. But differently, what we see is that the public views Canada's policies, our stances, our engagement with China as pretty much a proxy for the United States. And this hinders us. It hinders us greatly because even if that's not the reality, that's how the general public in China views Canadian sort of relationship with China. It's simply one in which that's grossly affected by the United States, and it's lockstep with the United States. So some of the questions we've also asked is, does knowing a country means trusting it? Let me put it to you in a different way here. There's a relationships. In other words, if you are engaged in public diplomacy to try to improve the image of a country, does that mean if you improve the image, are citizens more likely to trust the country? If you are to have more knowledge of the country, are you more likely to trust the country? So statistically speaking, the more knowledge you have of a country, the more likely you are to trust the country. So more knowledge generally means more trust. And we see this for all the cases in Russia, Germany, France, the EU, Australia, UK, Canada, India, except for Japan and the United States. So for the most part, I would suggest to you, if you are trying to get everyday citizens to trust your country more, they need to learn more about their country. And I'll tell you about some of the sources where they learn more about the countries. It's usually through social media. We see the gross majority of citizens are learning about foreign countries through social media. And this is across all age cohorts, it's across different regions, it's across different incomes, and various demographic sort of variables we utilize. Everyday citizens learn about a country through social media for the most part. And so the key idea here is more knowledge generally means more trust. And we can see this in the data here, where we see this sort of hybrid information environment. Where citizens learn about the world is through social media. And again, as I mentioned, across every demographic, that's the case. We see in terms of radio, newspapers, and television, this is becoming less and less as influential for citizens to learn about the world. Now, that's interesting analytically for one main reason. Foremost, when it comes to television, newspaper, and radio, if you are the state, you are more likely to influence those media sources more directly than you can influence social media. Let me put you in another way. If you are the television or newspaper or radio, you might get directives from the party, you might get directives from the state administrator about certain issues you may want to stress or may not want to stress. In other words, you can shape the public's image about a country more refinedly through television, newspaper, and radio if you're the state. Your social media, you do have some leeway, but it's not as much leeway as you have through television, newspaper, and radio. Now, what the top line there is effectively that if citizens are learning about the world through social media more and more, that means there's less influence the state has to actually shape the image that individuals have of foreign nations. So ultimately, this tells you that citizens are consuming the world through social media. If you want to influence the way they perceive your country, social media is the way, for the most part, that you can influence them the greatest. But of course, with the caveat that no single channel is going to reach everyone. Outreach must be tailored across generations, and even more so, realize that personal discussion that plays a major role. So social networks one has, it plays a major role in terms of how you perceive the country. And this can be reinforced through social media or traditional media. So what does this all mean? I'm giving you a snapshot of the report effectively. And so I do invite you to read the report and see what the data tells us over the last 4 years. What we see here is that this is a public that's settled into confidence, that Chinese citizens want their country to lead on peace and security above all, backed by a larger military footprint. And this is a very strong sort of pragmatism that complicates easy narratives. And so there are three tensions I thought I'll highlight. First and foremost, everyday citizens do not have an appetite for decoupling. Even with Japan, they do not have an appetite to decouple. So, in spite of the fact there's rivalrous sort of relationships, despite the fact that citizens might potentially resist cutting economic and technological ties, the West remains integral to China's development, and citizens recognize that. There's a recognition that survives any sort of frictions. Second, Russia is still embraced, but there's a cost. There's robust support for Russia that coexists with ever closer alignment, and it might complicate international engagement among those same publicly clear values, so to speak. So put differently, the Russia relationship is still strong with China. The citizens support it, but it is dwindling to some extent, but it's still super strong relative to all other jurisdictions. Finally, capability over ideology. Citizens want a stronger China, not one that exports its model. So we should demystify this idea that China wants to export its model overseas and have clones of China, so to speak. Citizens do not want that. I know there's elite sort of ideological ambitions for exporting China's model, but everyday citizens are not necessarily interested in that sort of case. So I've given you a snapshot of the report. What I want to give you some more evidence now, which we have not done in previous sort of presentations, is going from the survey to scholarship. So based on the four waves of data that we have, the rich data that we have, we can make some sort of scholarly sort of claims, shall we say, about Japan, about Russia, about the Carney sort of visit, about the Starmer's visit, what sort of impact that had, and really, does China's everyday citizens' norms and values, does that influence the way they perceive the world? So I'm going to say a few words about each sort of study. I mean, to be very frank, every study could be an entire talk to itself, but you're going to get a summary in a minute or two for every single study here. So let me start off by looking at this first sort of study. This looks at from compartmentalization to compression, Chinese public opinion towards Japan after the 2025 crisis. So it's interesting because we surveyed in the first quarter of 2026. We do that every year. And we found that there is some opportunistic sort of cases in which we can engage with, one being the Japanese case. So in late 2025, I think it was like in November of 2025, the Japanese prime minister made remarks on Taiwan. And Beijing had a very forceful response, which included a travel advisory to Japan and a wave of tourism cancellations. So what we're trying to figure out here in this particular study is, well, what does this sort of geopolitical shock do to the structure, not just the level of attitudes towards a rival state? So the central insight here really is about structure, not just about negativity. So before the shock, Chinese attitudes towards Japan were compartmentalized, so to speak. People could distrust Japan politically, but while still wanting to travel there and wanting to cooperate economically. And so there were basically two separate boxes, right? So you can distrust China, you can distrust it politically, but you might still want to visit Japan. You might still want to, engage with Japan in terms of studying or visiting or working. But we see after this quote unquote shock in November, we saw that reality completely changed. Everyday citizens in China did not want to visit Japan, did not want to study in Japan. There was this sort of complete sort of distrust that started to bleed into a willingness to cooperate, trade, or even visit Japan. So what we see here is a clear Japan-specific deterioration, not necessarily an anti-Western mood, but one measured against the United States and four other countries, that distrust and conflict expectations are rising, but so did the reluctance among cooperation and everyday contact. So the key bit here is that we have these two domains, right? If I was to suggest to you, if I was to describe the sort of Chinese public. They can, on the one hand, distrust you, but on the other hand, cooperate with you. So there's two mental sort of attitudes. What we see with the Japanese case is that that meant those two separate mental attitudes. That's been the reality for Japan over the last three waves. In the current wave, it completely shifted. That they do not trust Japan. Moreover, they do not want to engage with Japan. So it gives us some insights there in terms of how they might view the United States. If you recall, familiarity generally breeds trust. So the more familiar you are with a country, the more likely you're to trust that country, the more likely you want to cooperate with those countries. And we see that being the case for every nation we examine, except for the United States and Japan. So if you're in the United States, that tells you that it is possible for citizens in China to actually take this sort of this dual mental structure I'm talking about, where you can trust someone or not trust someone and yet want to engage with you. You can see if you're the United States, if there's a shock that happens with the United States, this can be the reality. You can have another Japan, so to speak. Another insight, this could be something for our Canadians on the call. When Carney visited China in January of this year, we were very opportune because we were running the survey at that time. So we have a sample that's half Carney's before Carney's visit, and another sample, half the sample was after Carney's visit. The same case happened for Starmer's visit, which happened 2 weeks after Carney's visit. So we have a sample that is before the visit and after the visit. So we have a pre and post sort of reality here. And again, we're looking at this idea that Chinese citizens have two different tracks. There's a pragmatic cooperation track and a security threat sort of track. This is important because we tend to believe that there's a very monolithic nationalistic framework that everyday citizens have. That's not the case. We see that citizens are very sophisticated in terms of being pragmatic in terms of their cooperation and distilling this sort of security threat. So Carney's visit and Starmer's visit were both economic visits. They were pitched as, let's get greater economic cooperation. Let's bring businesses from Canada and the UK to China and create greater relationships in that respect. What we see is that the Carney visit did not have that sort of security apparatus, whereas the Starmer's visit had that overlay of a security apparatus. But interestingly enough, we didn't see any sort of movements in either tracks. In other words, these visits that we've been seeing to China, these high-profile visits to China that's been occurring the last few months, are not necessarily moving public opinion. And in fact, we see that in any sort of estimators, so academically speaking, what was done here is just ran different models, different estimators to try and figure out, did citizens move in any respect in terms of their view of the country? It didn't. The Starmer visit did not create any sort of variations. There's still a distrust a quiet distrust of the UK. The Carney visit, statistically speaking, didn't move us very much. However, what it did is it set us up to some extent to actually improve relations with China. And I can say a few more words about that during Q&As, but essentially the summit itself did not shift public opinion, but the Carney visit didn't do anything negative to public opinion. Whereas the Starmer's visit did some negative opinion. It had some negative connotations, and which we would see in future waves, whereby he did not displace this sort of security threat sort of aspects, whereas the Carney visit did not have that sort of security apparatus at all. So put differently, what we see is that Canada is set up very well for future interactions with China in terms of cooperation based on these sorts of sort of data that we see. Whereas the British example suggests that they might have some headwinds. And this is reinforced here in terms of looking at a perception trap. So in this particular sort of study, we have a middle power, i.e. Canada, and a great power, i.e. China, and try to understand how they both look at each other. Essentially, what's being done here is this. In one of the waves of how China sees the world, we look at obviously how Chinese view Canada, but we also there's some surveys that was done how Canadians see China. And so what we try to do is match that up to see whether or not there's a sort of any sort of variance between how they see us and how we see them. So 28% of Canadians rate the relationship as important, yes, distrust China, versus under 8% of Chinese. So you can see the sort of trust inversion between Canada and China. Among Chinese respondents, perceptions of Canada-US ties are the single strongest predictor of trust in Canada. And really, there's this sort of proxy effect. In other words, um, as I mentioned beforehand, everyday citizens in China cannot see that the United States cannot divorce the United States from Canada. So this sort of proxy that Canada is a proxy for the US really only hits political trust. So it doesn't necessarily hit instrumental cooperation to a great extent. Put differently, if you are a policymaker, middle powers are read through their great power alignments, and it might be worthwhile leading with issue-specific cooperation rather than expecting gestures to move generalized trust. Um, Another sort of aspect to look at here is, does popular distrust of a rival power translate into support for disengaging from it, as decoupling accounts assume? What we see is that trust and cooperation are statistically separate domains, not two poles of one scale. We see perceived threat depresses trust far more than cooperation. So distrust coexists with sustained behaviorally echoed engagement. And there's a trust cleavage, and it tracks economic positions, and it's specific to the West. That's a nice way of suggesting, if looking at this chart, of saying that public distrust is not a mandate for decoupling, that citizens do not want to decouple. Statistically speaking, in any sort of regressions we run, any sort of models we run, Chinese citizens do not want to decouple from any sort of Western jurisdiction. Rather, they can have engagement because they have this sort of a mental disposition in which you can distrust one and still engage with another. And so this is what this sort of research illustrates here. Now, finally, how durable is Chinese affinity towards Russia? And is warm sentiment still tied to any willingness to engage personally? Now, as I mentioned beforehand, throughout this presentation, there is a strong affinity with Russia. And this has been pervasive throughout the entire waves of the how China sees the world sort of project. However, with that being said, 2024 was the peak. So this is where we saw peak trust in Russia. We start seeing trust declining steadily. So there is a decline in power is decoupled. So let me put it to you in a different way. The perceived Russian capability, so how China sees Russia's capability, it's held quite steady. So it's not a downgrade on Russian strength. Everyday Chinese tend to view Russia as being a very powerful nation. However, the social profile of pro-Russia sentiment is being remade. So we're seeing that the young are not as pro-Russia as it once before. So we're seeing some demographic shifts there. We still see that, nevertheless, we still see that citizens view that Russia has influence, that is still bilaterally important, but they're not willing to migrate, they're not willing to study, they're not willing to tour. Trust is slightly declining a little. So there is a sort of a view in which the Russia relationship is important, but it's not as important on many different indicators here. So the China-Russia bond is hauling at the people-to-people level, even as economic cooperation falls. Its popular base is narrow and more passive than the sort of no limits rhetoric. So in fact, before the Ukraine conflict with Russia, back in late 2022, or when it been mid or early 2022, I forget, but it was 2022 for sure, where Xi Jinping and Putin met. Xi said, we have a no limits relationship with Russia. And what we're seeing here is that, well, the everyday citizens were supportive of those no limits sort of relationship with Russia, but it is declining. It is, and so we would see in future iterations of the survey, I would strongly suspect an erosion of Chinese popular trust in Russia, meaning that there might be more leeway for China to actually be a bit more disagreeable towards Russia, at least from the eyes of the general public. Now, as I said, these are all 5 different studies that can be an entire talk to itself. I'm just summarizing it very quickly, as well as the report. There's so much data, so many data points that we can utilize and discuss. So I'll be happy to discuss them a bit more if there's something of interest to you during Q&As. Before I conclude, let me say a few words about methodology and limitations. As we've said, this is the 4th annual survey. There's 34 questions done on foreign relations, security, trade, technology, mobility, and governance. Most are on 7-point Likert scales. It was fielded in partnership with a mainland survey firm in the first quarter of 2026. We did stratified random sampling, both urban and rural, and across all the sort of provincial level divisions. Um, we have to also be mindful of preference falsification. As in any survey, whether it's in China or in Canada or the United States or the UK, anywhere in the world, really. But it's this idea that citizens can conceal their true beliefs under social and political pressure. This is a possibility. Mind you, with that being said, there's some statistical tools we can utilize to make sure that there's confidence in what citizens are saying is what they actually believe. Moreover, for some of these survey respondents, we were actually measuring eye tracking. So that was very helpful in trying to figure out whether or not. The idea is if you look up, maybe you're telling the truth. If you're looking down, maybe you're using your imagination. So there's a lot of tools we can utilize to increase reliability. But again, there's always this preference falsification that permeates in any sort of survey. Thus, do also treat year-over-year movements of a few points as suggestive and not definitive. But when there's some gross movements, we do point it out, and I think it is worthwhile exploring a bit more in depth in terms of our sort of research. Okay, I've said a lot. I'm going to end it here. You can scan the code there to see the report. The report's on the China Institute's website. Yes,